Hello, good morning. Let's change this layout. Awesome. I am super excited to be here with you today. This is going to be hopefully a shorter broadcast because it's very heavy and there will be like a little trigger warning because trauma is not easy to talk about, like in any capacity. Trauma is very, very difficult to deal with. It might be something that you may personally have experienced and or may have clinically experienced. There you go. That might be a little better for everybody. Okay, now always start off with some welcomes. So let's keep it light to just kind of jump in. I'm Carice. I am a registered dental hygienist, although I don't practice clinically anymore at all. I only do myofunctional therapy. I'm your myo best friend here every single week to bring you a new topic, a new conversation, and some realness because there's not enough genuine, authentic information out there about myofunctional therapy and how it really works and how it really is and why so many people are failing at it as opposed to the thriving, flourishing community that it really needs to be. And so I'm here every week, keeping it real with you as your myo best friend. So what you should do is subscribe if you haven't already. If you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe to my channel, turn on the notifications. I want to keep this going. And the only way to keep it going and to keep myo growing and to keep us all really in the state of excellence that I truly believe this field should be in, you've got to spread the word. And so the best way to spread the word and to contribute is to subscribe, comment, turn on notifications, share it, put it out wherever you are. So whether you're watching this on LinkedIn or you're watching this on YouTube, make sure that you're following along. Okay. So here's your trigger warning. Okay, guys, trigger warnings coming. And I want you to just really take this whole thing with a grain of salt. Okay. So we're going to be talking about trauma, and trauma doesn't have to be negative, but it can be a very tough topic for a lot of people to discuss, to hear, to talk about, to think about. And there's a number of reasons why it does create an impact on our bodies, just psychologically, physically, and there's many manifestations of trauma, but trauma doesn't have to be negative. So I start off with this warning that if trauma is not something that you want to talk about, hear about, or if at any point in time you feel like you need to leave this conversation, please exit expediently. You do not have to stay for the whole thing. Trauma is important for us to talk about as clinicians. If you are a myofunctional therapist, or if you're a dental hygienist, or if you're just thinking about potentially getting into myofunctional therapy, it is incredibly relevant to myofunctional therapy. We don't talk about it enough. There's not enough education on it. And so I'm really excited to be here talking about it with you today. So let's dive into just the definition as per the dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary of what trauma is. It's a deeply distressing or disturbing experience or a physical injury, both of which are things that head and neck, these things are constantly at risk when there's car accidents, sports injuries, falls, any sort of, abuse or, distressing or disturbing experience, traumatic experience is something in where you will see this appear in your therapeutic modality. So, as a myofunctional therapist, just understand that there is value in what we do for trauma. We are not by any means and 100% never try to be the sole source of how they resolve their trauma, because OMT can be a very, very valuable way for you to contribute to how they will get over some of the trauma. It creates a great foundation for them to do future therapy with a therapist, a licensed psychiatrist, psychologist, clinical social worker, whoever is going to do talk therapy with them to actually help them move through the trauma, that they can access more of those emotions and they can maintain themselves in a better bodily state and physiological combined with the cognitive state. They can keep themselves in a better state to progress through talk therapy better. So the way that we talk about myofunctional therapy and how it helps speech therapy goals, or how it might help occupational therapy goals, and how collaboration is really the key, what we really need to think about is in the mental health space and with trauma, and how we see these things, that these are things that we can help be a foundation for, so that they can get better outcomes in other places and with other members of the team. Okay. We will come back to this slide and I'll kind of discuss it a little bit more in depth after we go through some bit about trauma. But trauma does not have to be negative. Trauma can be an adaptive response that can wind up being positive in some way, shape, or form. And as an adaptive response, that's more of that psychological or behavioral coping mechanism. So you might be disassociating, you might be exhibiting higher levels of anxiety that you're able to suppress a pain response. You're able to kind of put down any other emotions that you might have around it and just heighten with the anxiety your awareness of your situation. And we'll get into an example, a great example of that in just a second. Or it can manifest as a physical response. So that cognitive, that mental or physical maintenance that relives the trauma and keeps it and stores it. And if you have not read The Body Keeps the Score, you really need to. It's a very thick book and it's at times difficult to read. And there are a lot of examples in there and there are a lot of things in there that might be triggering as well. And so I don't take that recommendation of the book lightly, but it is a great source of information. How you can also source information, and I love the concept of you don't have to pay for everything. So if you can't get a book right now, don't get a book. Go on Google, go on YouTube. There are going to be lots of great summaries of the book, a lot of great anthologies where they're putting together all of the concepts and really making it a whole understandable unit in a 45-minute read or in a 45-minute YouTube video. So make sure you get that education in some way, shape, or form. But trauma doesn't have to be negative. So trauma can be adaptive. And my best example actually came from something recently that I found one of my children watching. So I have 4 children, but really I have 2 adults, 2 children, technically. So this movie was a little bit jarring for me personally, as I was like, what are you watching? And then I kind of got roped in. And it was this Lifetime movie story called Believe Me, The Abduction of Lisa McVeigh. Now, Lisa McVeigh had a traumatic experience or multiple traumatic experience. She was a victim of domestic sexual abuse by her grandmother's boyfriend. Everything was very much well known in the household and the home. And she was at the brink of the point where she just didn't want to be around anymore. And coincidentally, the day that she had intended to really like put an end to her own personal suffering, she got abducted. Now, in this abduction, it really is a really great example of a highly adaptive response to trauma. For being abducted, for being blindfolded, for being unable to really know what's going on, she could have shut down. Instead, her senses were heightened. She was able to really assess her surroundings, where she was, what direction they were going in, what the building, how many steps it took for him to take her to a certain location. Like, she was really heightened in her awareness. She was very violently abused during the time while she was with this man. I think it was 26 hours that she was abducted for. But during that time, she was actually able to empathize with her abductor. She was able to get the abductor to really see her as a human and see him as a human. And though she was so violently assaulted during the entire 26 hours that she was with him, he felt compassion for her and was able to let her go. It's a bigger story. It's really worth the watch. It's worth the read about her story. But in a traumatic situation, instead of shutting down, because this man was a serial killer, and every other woman, every young girl that he abducted, because these were all around teenage girls, every young girl that he abducted, he did subsequently murder. It was her, and her enhanced sense of awareness and her ability to kind of disassociate from what was happening in order to survive and protect herself, that was able to allow her to get through that bit of trauma. And so trauma doesn't have to be anything that is inherently negative. It can be something that gets you through so that you can survive and you can move on. A lot of times when trauma happens, though, it can be something that can leave you stuck. And so that's the difference between that adaptive and that physical response that you would have. So let's look at some of the stats because I think it's not talked about enough, and there's so many people. And if you've been practicing anything, so whether it be dental hygiene, speech, occupational therapy, like whatever, you've been practicing anything, if you've been a human, you've been in contact with somebody who has been a victim of some form of trauma or adverse childhood event or something, you have been in contact with someone. You may not have known it. You were likely very, very unaware. You may have seen some signs and maybe those were ignored, or maybe they have repressed those memories. But I'm telling you, you have been in contact with someone, maybe multiple someones that have been in these experiences. Over half of all women and a quarter of all men in the US, as according to the last set of CDC data, Center for Disease Control data, that was done and collected in 2017. That's 1 in 2 women. For every woman that you talk to, one may have not and one may have. If you walk into your nearest grocery store, over half of the women in that store have experienced some sort of sexual assault or violence in the United States. 1 in 4 men have experienced sexual assault or violence in the United States. And so these are some really big, glaring points that I think we all need to be very aware of. It is very much more common than you and I would like to think and would like to even sometimes express. About a quarter of children experience childhood abuse or neglect, or they witness domestic violence. I mean, most people have some form of an adverse childhood experience, and they say that 3 or more of those make you more likely to have a lot of things: depression, anxiety, substance abuse, those types of things that are going to negatively impact your future, your health, and your outcomes. Okay. So you're coming across this, whether, you believe it or not, it's something that you're absolutely witnessing and coming across day to day. So it's important to know what to look for or what you may see. It's common for us to see all forms of trauma, and not all of the trauma has to be like a violent trauma. Some of it could be a fall off of a bike, a skateboard accident, a car accident, a fall downstairs, a fall outside on the asphalt, a fall on ice, a broken nose, fractures in the head and neck area, sexual abuse, physical abuse. It could be any number of things, but most people have come across or experienced some form of trauma in the head and region. And so these are things that we want to look out for when we are looking and doing our evaluations. I don't know that I've ever come outright and asked anybody if they have experienced trauma. I do ask actually if they've had like car accidents, falls, head and neck injuries, and so forth. But I don't think that I've asked about like abuse and violence and that type of trauma. But ways that you might be able to tell. So in this picture here is petechiae. Now, as a dental hygienist, I will tell you that there are some people who we might look at, and maybe some people we have really good rapport with, and we know them and we know their families, and we could see petechiae, and it could be very light, and we're like, "Ooh, I know what you did last night." But there are some instances where you may run into children who are experiencing or exhibiting petechiae in the soft palate, who have like lacerations, gags. Technically, it give a big mark on the commissures, the labial commissures, the corners of the lips. You may see all sorts of signs of sexual abuse or sexual violence in children or in sex trafficking victims or victims of domestic violence and abuse. A lot of these are signs that you don't want to ignore. I know we're always looking for in OMT, we're looking for, do we need expansion? Is it a vaulted palate? Is there tori? I mean, what we really should be looking for as we're looking for all of that is to look and see what's going on with the soft tissues, what's going on with the dentition. Not just if it's crowded, not just if it is periodontally compromised, we should be looking to see, are there any loose teeth, fracturing, displaced, missing teeth, any bite marks on the face, on the neck, on the, anywhere. Oftentimes you'll find some of those bite marks in peculiar areas, in areas that you wouldn't really think. I remember once there was a person who we wiped some makeup off for some pictures, and there was a bite mark on the forehead, and I'm like, why is there a bite mark on the forehead? I'm not going to ask too many questions, but if I see more than just that, we're definitely getting into this and we're going to have a conversation. Bruising, jaw fractures, unexplained injuries that, it's not, oh, I had hot pizza and that's why my palate looks burned. It's severe. There can be burn marks, like cigarette burn marks inside the mouth. That's a form of violence that I've seen and I've witnessed in my dental hygiene career. And so you want to be looking for any abnormalities, just as you would if you were clinically in dentistry and you would be looking for some of these signs and symptoms. We are mandatory reporters. So when we find these things, we need to say something. You see something, say something. And so it's really important that you bring a lot of that over into the myofunctional therapy because it's going to make an impact. Now, why does it make an impact? Because trauma in and of itself is going to change the physiological perception that happens in the mind. So the trauma is going to be processed in one way or another. Now, trauma affects your body, it affects your mind, and it affects your relationships. So something is going to shift, and memory of such will shift too. Oftentimes, and a lot of people, they might disassociate entirely, and that memory completely gone. That is a protective mechanism from our amygdala. That is something that is going to completely wipe out, and they won't really even understand until it's triggered that they've had this traumatic experience and that this traumatic experience is being triggered in this way. But trauma is going to change our physiological perception, like how we are processing it. It's going to change how our bodily hormones respond, including the adrenal glands and the production of cortisol and all these things that we're going to get into very, very shortly. But it's going to change how the body is going to respond, and that will leave a lasting memory or dump a memory. Okay. In the book by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, he discusses many different levels of trauma, how the trauma is stored in these three different ways, and how it impacts relationships, the body, and the mind. When I work with trauma, or one way I can know I've worked with some form of trauma, is by assessing the body mapping. Body mapping is incredibly powerful, very, very powerful. Let's take a traumatic event like a skateboard accident where you tried to go down a rail, and immediately I think of like all these shows with these videos like Tosh.0 or ridiculous. You're on, you fall off, and let's say you weren't wearing a helmet, or even if you were, that's very jarring even if you were. But sometimes you fall on your face, sometimes you lose a tooth, sometimes you break something, like you're fracturing something. You're going to have some sort of injury. But let's say you fell, and you fell on your left side. Okay, so you've fallen, boop, you hit your left side. But also it impacted your arm, and you may have rolled a little bit, and your leg. So your left arm and your right leg have been impacted. Sometimes that will leave a lasting impression and traumatic physiological association and memory of your touch or physical sensory perception on the left side of your face with your left arm and your right leg. So if I was to touch, or I take a feather or I take a cotton ball and I was to touch on this left side of your face, you might get a sensation on your right leg and in your left arm. And you're like, I don't know why that's happening, but I got a little like tingle on my left leg. And so when we're body mapping, we're kind of looking to see where perception is on the face. And I don't really go into the neck area, honestly, but on the face to see if all of the sensory skills are there, are present, are accurate in the body. That way, if I'm trying to work on some fine motor skills, because that's all myofunctional therapy is, it's really working on those fine motor skills in this area. I need to know that you have good global perception of what's going on, that you have fine-tuned perception, yes, of what's going on. That way I can access and you can freely access what it is that you need to do. So what instructions I'm giving, what muscles you need to activate and work on, where you need to relax, and how you're going to coordinate this task. If we're going to do that, it can't have any interruption from the body where now you're getting this tingle and you're like, I don't know, I've got this twinge in my hip and I don't like it when I do this particular exercise because this twinge in my hip, it's bothering me. And so now I have to re-coordinate, and that's okay. Changing up the plan happens a lot in myofunctional therapy. But now I have to re-coordinate how I'm presenting this information to you, how you are going to do it. I'm troubleshooting and trying to get to a new outcome with you. And in that new outcome, if I continue to ignore that you have a twinge in your hip, or I'm like, hey, don't worry about it. Go see your craniosacral therapist. Go see your osteopath. Go see your chiropractor. And they'll talk to you about the twinge in your hip and what's going on there. That's an okay option. That's absolutely the right thing to do 10 out of 10 times. However, I don't want to ignore it. So I use body mapping as a way of connecting back the senses and getting everything to come back from a dissociated state to a unified state. Okay. So then the body keeps the score because that's what we're supposed to talk about. Um, this book was analyzed for mapping and body mapping a disassociated body. And Dr. Crawford had stated quite eloquently that those who have experienced traumatic events often lack a coherent memory for or understanding about the trauma they have undergone. They may be haunted by inchoate bodily sensations and memories that have not been fully integrated and cannot be put into language. Such splits in experience between body and mind can provide a means to understand the way we conceptualize memory, consciousness, and body mind. Body and mind is what we're always trying to connect in myofunctional therapy. That's like literally the only goal we have, is to create neuromuscular repatterning on a subconscious level, so that now, instead of the dysfunction that they were exhibiting, they are now going to exhibit and utilize proper functional movements, skills, coordination, and so forth. And this is on a habitual basis where it happens without their cognitive awareness of such. We can't do that if there's a disassociation between body and mind. And a lot of times with trauma, that's all it is. We got to disassociate body and mind. And so reconnecting those points is incredibly important in OMT, and we'll get back into that in a second, right? But let's talk about what Dr. Vanderkolk says is the most common manifestation: immobilization. When trauma happens, oftentimes they shut down and depersonalize the situation. It wasn't something that happened to me. This is something that the body is trying to ego protect. In my book, Accomplished: How to Sleep Better, Eliminate Burnout, and Execute Goals, I tell the story of my son and a very traumatic event that still kind of haunts me to this day. What's interesting is that as I'm going to tell you this story, I'm literally in the room and in the space upon which it happened. And so it's going to be a little weird talking about it. But I was a very young mother, and I had my first child at 18. Well, 2 weeks before I turned 19, he was born. And when I turned 21, 2 weeks later, I had my daughter, my first daughter. Now, my daughter was a baby, and I'm 21 years old, and I'm living with my family, and I'm with my parents, and they are watching my son because he's running around. He's 2. I've got like this newborn. She's maybe a month old. She really wasn't that old. So I've got pretty much this newborn, and she is in the crib. I'm getting ready to change her diaper, and I hear this screeching sound of brakes, and something in my head, in my heart, I don't know, something was like, my son? And immediately I went to the window. I don't know why I would think that screeching brakes is my child, okay? My parents' house is on a corner lot, and there is like this weird corner that people cut around so fast. It's ridiculous. The house across the street, our neighbors across the street, have lost 2 trees because people cut around this corner and then will like go swerving into their yard and knock down trees. It's absolutely outrageous sometimes. It's not overly common, but it's more common than it should have been. So this corner, people could be screeching for all kinds of reasons. One, because they realize they're going too fast and they need to slow down. Why are you going down that fast down a residential street? It's absurd. But immediately my first thought is my son. So I went to the window, and of course, what do I see? In the headlights of a stopped car, my child in the middle of the street. Now, he wasn't hit by this car. He's like standing there, and it was just the most surreal. I can't even tell you. There's a lot of disassociation that goes on in my mind because I can't even tell you how I switched and immediately ran out. So, like, there's a baby here without a diaper, and I just ran outside. And then I'm out there, and he's not there. And I'm like, what happened? Like, where did he go? And the person who was driving the car is like, that way. And there's woods all in the back. And so I'm like, oh my God. First of all, who can even process why he was out there? I don't know. I can't process it. But why he was out there, I don't know. Now he's in the woods, and there's like whatever in the woods. Like, I don't even know what's in the woods, but there's got to be things in the woods. Like, where's this kid? And so I go running into the back. And so I go running into the back looking for him, and trying to figure out like what's going on. And then I start to hear rustling of my parents, and I look at the back of the house, and I realize that the back sliding door is open. Now, him as a 2-year-old child, very, very curious about this backsliding door. And, he's always seen us like open it or close it or whatever. And so he went to go open it. And, you take your eyes off a kid for just a second, like a second. And he was playing with my dad. And then my dad went to go like grab something really quick. And in that quick second, he slid that door open, ran outside, ran around the house to the front in the street for God knows what reason. Because I don't know, he's 2. So who knows? He didn't even know, I guess, the reason. And screeching car. Now I'm outside. I'm looking for him. I find him. He winds up back on the deck and back inside the house. And, we're all like very, very alarmed that this has happened. Now, this is something that he is going to be 21 very soon. Like, I am not anywhere close to like this happening yesterday. This is at least 18, 19 years ago for him. And at times that still will get me. That still will have me stuck. Like, I might be in a conversation with someone, and for some reason I just get completely like glazed over because my mind will take me back for whatever reason it might have triggered. My mind will take me back to that moment, seeing him outside, and I'm like, my son, and I have to go get him. And it's like it was that vulnerability of not knowing why it happened, how it happened, feeling guilty, like not understanding, having complete lack of control over that situation that made it so traumatic. even though nothing bad happened to him, he's totally fine. He doesn't even remember this. He thinks it's a funny story now that he tells people. And it's not, it's a traumatic story for me. But the immobilization will still come over me from time to time. And I can't even tell you what triggers it. And so I'm very sensitive to people who become immobilized to these types of things, because that, in addition to my own adverse childhood experiences, my own adult uh, experiences with trauma and violence and so forth, like that is something I'm very sensitive to, is the immobilization. So a lot of people might have those moments where you can't really reclaim them and they can't really recall why it's happening. You may have had conversations with people and maybe you didn't even realize that that's what was happening. You're like, hello, did you just like zone out? They might have re-experienced the traumatic experience and they're not willing or able to vocalize that adequately. Memory loss also happens too, where sometimes they just don't even realize that that was a thing and it doesn't create that impression. That's a trigger. Like the amygdala is going to stay stuck on high alert. And so anything that will reproduce that trigger will now, similarly to PSTD, tell you that, okay, we're in that situation again. So when I get lost, I see visually in my mind that whole situation. I see my son in the headlights. I see myself so far away, unable to reach, and like terrified, absolutely terrified. If I was to hear a car screech, granted, I'm in the same space, but when I hear a car screech, it kind of will take me back there as if I'm in that experience again, which is part of that PTSD. It's like when fireworks go off for certain veterans and they're hearing combat. They're not hearing a firework and a celebration. They're hearing active combat. And so for them, that PTSD is that amygdala that's still on high alert and they can't really associate the memory of the exact trigger and thing with where they are now. So it's a disassociation from the memory and the trauma and where they are in their sense of safety currently. Okay. So immobilization and memory loss, important things to remember that happen and occur with trauma. Not everybody can vocalize their trauma. And if you're not a specialist who is, very well trained and educated on this, don't expect people to talk to you about their trauma and, don't expect to try to heal them from it. What you should be aware of, though, is the stress hormone cortisol and how that directly impacts how trauma directly impacts our cortisol. Now, while the trauma is occurring, our adrenal glands will pump up as a response to, like, a sympathetic response so that we can get into that fight or flight. Our cortisol will pump up. We'll have high levels of cortisol. That's going to increase your heart rate. It's going to increase blood flow so that you can run faster. You're going to breathe faster. You're going to hyperventilate, create more oxygen. That way your body can really move and you can go. It's going to suppress sensitivities to certain types of pain. Your immune system is now going to be down. You're not going to be healing as fast. Your reproductive system is going to go down. Like, the cortisol is creating all of the impact. Okay. But what we have is a typical state of cortisol. And that typical state of cortisol, we want to remain at current levels of cortisol. But traumatic experiences at the height of the trauma is going to impact it upwards. But then afterwards, it tends to drop the cortisol levels. And cortisol is actually really important for what we do, because cortisol plays a big role in sleep and sleep regulation, and having lower cortisol happens naturally in sleep. But imagine if you've had a trauma, now that trauma has your cortisol level low, and then you go to sleep and your cortisol drops even lower, and now your new baseline is, it's inadequate. So you're at a deficit for cortisol, which is going to impact you psychologically, physiologically, anatomically. Okay. Anatomically, that's that sensory perception, the mismapping. So when I talk about, I do body mapping, and that's something for another time, another place. I probably won't do it on a live stream. That's something that'll probably come up as a myomodality thing. That's where I talk about that. That's where I demonstrate body mapping and how I do it and why I do it and whatever. But, and that's in the Myo Launch library of courses. But to talk about what happens in the anatomical sense, like your body will not have appropriate mapping to where I touch here and you only feel it here. I'll touch here and you'll feel it in other stimulated areas that are associated. Like if you were bound and gagged and, experienced a certain type of abuse or violence and you were bound and gagged, your wrists, your lips, like everything might be associated with wherever you were hit and held, because these are all your trauma physical or anatomical locations. Psychophysiologically, restless sleep, decreased sleeping times, you can't stay asleep as long, you're waking up more frequently, you get more dorsal vagal tone when you're triggered, so you're more likely to hit that trauma induced period of like, I'm not going to socially interact, I am like very stimulated. The psychosocial and the anatomical effects of trauma, you'll kind of recognize as like, oh yeah, we see a lot of these things in people. We see a lot of these things commonly in the people who are referred to myofunctional therapy, the people who need myofunctional therapy, the people who are struggling with sleep. Just know that some of these things that they are struggling with, so sleep is not like a universal blanket thing. It's not you have obstructive sleep apnea or you have UARS, which isn't a diagnosis, but you have UARS or you have something and it's just blanket. You need Myo. There are a lot of different reasons why people might be experiencing certain types of disruptions in their sleep and their sleep patterns. And there are a lot of other manifestations of sleep disorders that don't just revolve around how they breathe. And so not everybody with a sleep problem is struggling only with their breathing, but it is something to be very highly aware of, that the impact of hormones and cortisol, all of that is going to determine their sleep quality and how you can get back to a good state. When there is heightened cortisol, I think there was a really big shift in movement on TikTok, on Instagram. I was seeing it a lot with the somatic exercises and how you can bring down those cortisol levels. But once the cortisol is low, how do you get it back high? That is the bigger question, because it's not a case of just somatic exercises. It's a case of really resolving the trauma through um, like teamwork, through interdisciplinary cares and models. So let's talk about the value of myofunctional therapy. It's really to establish, again, that connection between the body and the mind. So that disassociation that's happening, we want them to become more heightened and aware of the cues, of the signs, of the things their body is telling them. All of their senses they're going to become highly in touch with. Breath work is going to help to manage the autonomic nervous system and their ability to self-sustain an autonomic nervous system that's at rest at parasympathetic mode, and when it needs to be stimulated, sympathetic mode, and then go back to parasympathetic mode so that they can establish a nice baseline of not maintaining and holding on to an amygdala that is just firing at high alert. So, with that, it creates a foundation upon which where they are now and their current sense of safety. Ideally, if you're watching this, you're safe. You wouldn't be on YouTube or LinkedIn and you're in an unsafe environment. So, your safety currently and your memories of trauma, which are going to leave you unsafe, but the ability to recognize these two, to be more in touch with the bodily cues that are associated with them. That happens a lot with myofunctional therapy, body mapping, breath work, like all the different things that we're doing, rhythmic movement. If you're doing any sort of dynamic breath work where you're including movement and breath, like Qigong, that's going to be the ideal way for you to be able to establish that foundation where you're blending that work that we've done with the right ideal situation upon which to start a talk therapy session. Because now you can manage, this is what my body is telling me, these are the cues, these are the signs, this is what it's really bringing up for me, and they can work on that with a licensed therapist and somebody who is qualified to be able to talk to them about that. And so you're really like the alley oop. So myofunctional therapy is the alley-oop for working through trauma with talk therapy. How does that look in your sessions? How might you see this manifest in sessions? They might have a sudden and unexplained trigger to an intraoral touch or a movement or a request that you've made, or you do a certain something. So whether you are asking them to mimic a certain movement, you might be asking them to cut their tongue like a bowl, and that might trigger a memory of a hyperactive gag where it just was very aggressive, and then that made them go into a bowl. So it could be a trigger that is going to now put them in that state of immobilization, or it might put them into a state of really defensiveness, or they might want to withdraw entirely. They could now be unable to or unwilling to cooperate in tasks. If you're asking them to now, okay, well, now, can you create the bowl? No, I can't. Okay, well, let's try it. No, I don't want to try it. Can we do something else? Can we move on? All right, you got it. We're going to move on. We'll move towards something else, and then we'll come back to that a little bit later. I don't want to come back to it. Well, it might be that resistance to moving through a task that you might see, and that might be your sign, your indication there that, oh, maybe there's some trauma associated with this. How do you manage it, right? Clinically, I like to create safe spaces. I want everybody to feel safe in the spaces. Now, how I do that in my practice, what I love is that I do mobile therapy. So I go to my clients' homes. I am in their spaces. Their home is already a safe space. I am just a new person walking in. However, for my home office, when people come to my home office and when they see all the bright colors and they have the ability to have the squish balls, the stress balls, to bounce, to vibrate, to move freely, to stand, sit, lay on whatever surface they would like to in that office and in that space, it just creates a safe space. This is a space where it is all yours, where I am just an accessory, and this is now your world. Feel free to touch, move, displace, do whatever you would like in this space. It is your space. So I like to create safe spaces and nothing leaves the room. So anything that's discussed in there, it doesn't leave the room. Even if it's something about the provider you're working with, like, oh, you referred me to so and so, and I really didn't like this about them. Okay, understood. I'm sorry you had that experience. This is not going to go out to that provider. They don't need to know what you've talked to me about today. Create a safe space. Always ask for permission. I always ask if they're ready. I always ask if they are, if they're ready, if they feel confident about it. Like, are you confident to move forward? Like, can we move on? I'm always asking for their permission for whatever it is. Like, can I touch? I would like to do such and such. So I'm going to talk to them first. I would like to touch and feel some of your facial muscles. That way I can see how strong they are. Is that okay? Yes. All right. Here's what I want to do. I want to take my fingers, my two fingers here, and I'm going to put one on your ear right there. Is that okay? Yes. I'm going to put another one on the other side, just like that. Is that okay? So I'm always asking for permission. That way, any unwanted touch, they're always okay to say no. They can opt out at any point in time. I want feedback frequently. You should always be calling for feedback. I'm always asking, how does that feel? And sometimes people are like, what are you talking about? Like, we just made our tongue look like a taco. How does that feel? I don't know. Annoying that you're asking me how it feels. That's okay. It might be annoying for you, but for somebody else, it could be a trigger. And if it's a trigger, I want to know. I want to know how they're feeling. How are you feeling? I feel a bit uncomfortable because, it kind of like made something twinge in my back, and I really don't know why that's happening. Awesome. I'm glad that I had a safe space for you to feel able to say that. And let's talk about that more. Like, I'm always asking for feedback. So it doesn't matter who I'm working with. If it's somebody who has never exhibited any signs of trauma, I'm always asking for feedback. Please get into the habit of asking for feedback. Even with the children, I'm always like, how does this feel? How do you feel? How does your tongue feel? Did it feel like a pain? Did you feel any discomfort? Did it feel great? Do you feel stronger? Do you feel weaker? Like, how are you feeling? Just, I want all of the cues as often as possible. I leave space as much as I can. So I'm always trying to read the room. And if they're overwhelmed by whatever the instructions were, whatever it was that they're supposed to be doing or not doing, if they are overwhelmed, I'm leaving space. You want to take a break? Okay, let's take a break. How was school today? Or did you learn something new? Or what are you excited about in the next month or so? What do you have coming up? Or do you have a new work trip planned or whatever? And so now we're leaving some space where we're not going to talk about or do any sort of myofunctional anything. We are just going to allow some grace and some space. We've done 2 exercises and you're tapped out, you're maxed out, you look exhausted. Let's stick on those 2. I'm going to leave some space and we'll see where we're at next time when I see you. But keep me updated. Let me know like what's going on. If at some point in time you're feeling anything outside of the normal, please let me know. Okay. That way we can come back to that. I'm going to step back from the myo when I need to. I don't start any of my patients with myo. I always start everybody out with nasal hygiene and cranial nerve integration. So I'm always starting out there. But if I see that we need to take space from myo because there are triggers or there were certain things I saw in the evaluation that lead me to believe that this is going to be something where we have to go slowly into any sort of oral work, intraoral work, exercises, and so forth, taking a step back, move forward to modalities. All of my modalities are going to be addressed first. So now we're going to look at the primitive reflexes. We're going to look at their movement and their ability to rhythmically move. We're going to integrate breath work. We're going to do other things before we get back into the myo. So feel free to take a step back from the myo and go into things like breath work that are going to help unite that mind-body experience, to do things that are going to help them to sort of be meditative and introspective and to have more of that introspection. And then have a mental health or trauma specialist in your network. If you have not connected with one of those because in your intro course, you were told that you can only connect with, like, I don't know, dentists and physicians and sleep doctors and whatever, please connect with a mental health specialist. A mental health specialist, a psychologist. You can connect with somebody who's going to do a little bit of of um, the clock that moves. It's the subconscious work. I've lost the name of it, but you know what it is. You know what it is. They do the little clock thingy and then it swings back and forth. Hypnosis. That's what it is. Having a hypnosis provider or specialist in your network too. Sometimes that's incredibly helpful, especially with habits and those hard to break habits. Having a mental health specialist for trauma, having a hypnotist for trauma or for hard to break habits, really, really helpful. Okay. So the ways to deal with trauma are always to leave some space and to leave it to the professionals, but always have an open mind as you're going into these things. Okay. So I really want to end off. I thought I was going to end in a half hour, but that's okay. I really want to end off on a positive note that trauma, even if it's you're dealing as a clinician for the people you're working with, I want you to leave compassion for yourself. If some of these things are kind of new to you, or you feel like you may have missed something with someone along the way that you were working with, and you're like, how did I miss that sign? What did I do? Why didn't I see something or say something or whatever? Have compassion for yourself. You don't know what you don't know, and that's okay. We all don't know everything, right? And so it's okay to have that space. But make sure that you're leaving space for the people that you're working with and leaving space as well for yourself. Okay. So putting all of that together, I want to really wish you a fabulous day. If you would like CE for this, this recording is actually going to go into the myomentality system. And so myomentality, if you go to myomentality, literally spelt like that, myomentality.com, and you're going to see the membership there. That's where you can get CEs for a lot of these lectures that I do, and where you can access certain things like additional modalities, posture work, promotional skills, marketing, and all sorts of myo skills and education, but with CE. It has been an absolute pleasure being with you. I hope you give yourself grace and that you do better going forward, because that's all I'm trying to do every day is just be a little bit better than I was the day before. So have a fabulous weekend. I will see you on the next one. Bye, guys.